Gotcha. Done.
All right, going live. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Art Escape program. My name is Nicole, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Robert Mintz about some of the cutest, most charming little objects in our collection, the netsuke. While everybody's filing in and getting comfortable, I'm just going to go over the details for today's program. We are going to go through a brief greeting and introduction, followed by the Tiny Things video. And after that, we are going to do a question and answer with Dr. Robert Mintz. Before we get started, though, we do want to do a land acknowledgement. So I would like to acknowledge that the land that we are gathered on is the ancestral homeland of the Ohlone peoples who stewarded this land for generations. We pay respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging, for they hold the memories, traditions, and culture of their peoples across the nation. We extend our respect to the Ohlone Ramaytush, coastal Miwok, as well as other indigenous people who are present. And so I'm just going to familiarize yourself with a couple of things on here. If you have attended an Art Escape before, this is probably old news, but there are a few different features that I just want you to pay attention to while you are engaging in the Art Escape. There is the chat feature that you can find towards the bottom of your screen. And then there is also the Q&A. Two big differences between them. The chat feature you can use to talk to everybody. And a helpful hint about that, I've noticed that sometimes my chat feature will get stuck on panelists only. And so I would recommend looking to the bottom right area. And if it says panelists only, change that to panelists and attendees, because if it's panelists only, not many people will be able to see your responses. So I would just recommend changing that to panelists and attendees so you can all chat between each other. The Q&A, on the other hand, is only seen by us. It'll be seen by myself, Rob, and the people that are helping out on the back end, Michael and Sarah, and this is where we will pull your questions from. Please don't put your questions into the chat, because we're not going to be paying super close attention to that. We'll be focusing on that Q&A section. So while everybody is getting comfortable, let's play the chat right now. I am wondering, what are you most excited about at the Asian Art Museum in the next year? Are you excited about our new art terrace? Are you excited about our new pavilion? Are you a docent and you're just excited to come back into the museum and see all of your docent friends? So please put in the chat right now what you are most excited about seeing at the Asian Art Museum over the next 7 months. All right, and while everybody is doing that, I have a lot of fun announcements to make. So we are now open, and the Asian Art Museum is open on Thursdays from 1 until 8 o'clock, Fridays through Mondays, 10 a.m. through 5 p.m. We're currently closed Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and the first Sunday of every month is our free day. And if you are interested in enhancing your Asian Art Museum experience, I recommend becoming a member. Our member levels start at $89, and you get a plethora of benefits with your Asian Art Museum membership. You get invitations to our members only days, our preview days, and ticket pre-sales. So when we are able to open our new pavilion and our art terrace, you will be some of the first to see it. You also get invitations to our virtual member lounge. And so not only would you get all of the art escapes for free and all of our virtual tours that are coming up for free, you get special members only access to special member events. You also receive discounts for parking in the museum cafe and the museum boutique, as well as free admission to our collections and special exhibition galleries anytime you visit. This is an example of all the new fun things that are happening at the museum. We have had so many new contemporary art installations installed while the pandemic was raging, and also some new ones that were added while we were opening our doors. You can see Chanel Miller's piece, you can see Zhang Zhongbin's piece, you can see the After Hope collection, a series of videos from independent filmmakers all over Asia. And so there is so much new stuff to see at the Asian Art Museum. Whether you're a member or you're not, there's something new for you to view. And who am I? If you'd attended the Artscapes before, you probably recognize me. My name's Nicole. I'm the manager of guest experience and group sales, and I oversee a couple of different areas. We oversee the ticketing department, the information desk, the concierge station, private tours, group visits, and also accessibility resources. In this Artscape, we're going to talk about some of the tiniest items in our collection. And so if you want a magnifying glass so that you can view all of the like intricate details of it, stop by the information desk. We have magnifying glasses for you. So there's so much to see at the Asian Art Museum. And today we will be chatting with Dr. Robert Mintz. Dr. Mintz is the Deputy Director of the Asian Art Museum. He has a lot of hats here. He oversees the Curatorial, Education, and Museum Services Department. He provides strategic direction for exhibitions, education, interpretation, and public programs. He began studying the arts of Japan in the 1980s and got his BA from the University of Michigan and his PhD from the University of Washington. After his graduate studies, he taught the history of East Asian art for Seattle University, where he also served as the director of the university's Kinsey Art Gallery. In 2006, he was hired as the curator of Asian art by the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, Maryland. He left the Walters in 2016 to come here. And he is currently the deputy director, where he looks forward to the upcoming months when the expanding museum will open and new galleries, new exhibitions, new programs will happen. All of the things that you're throwing into the chat, that's what we're excited for too. So welcome, Dr. Robert Mintz.
Thanks, Nicole. Hi, it's great to be here. Hi, everybody. I'm glad to be able to share this Saturday afternoon with you. Nicole told me that I had a few minutes to make an introduction. I am Robert Mintz. It's a pleasure to be here. As I was thinking about what I should say as a way of introduction, I found myself thinking right now in the news, all of us are hearing about, all of us are seeing the tragedy that is currently going on in India. And I feel like we as members of the Asian Art Museum and as friends of the arts of Asia and scholars of the arts of Asia, we all need to be taking a very close look and be very aware of what is happening. I want to urge you to not only keep your ears open and listen to what's happening, but also take action where you can. There are many organizations, including the Red Cross and UNICEF and all sorts of other organizations doing good work to try to rush vaccine to India, to try to help with the crisis that is unfolding there. But it is, within my lifetime, it's one of the worst things I think I've seen. Just enormous numbers of people, losing their lives and families being torn apart. And it's simply something that I think we all need to work together to try to address. And of course, all of us have just been through a rather challenging year facing the pandemic. And I think, here in San Francisco, at least, it's feeling like we really have turned a corner and optimism seems to be on everybody's face. I see people's faces outdoors for the first time in a very long time. And it's great to feel the optimism that we have, but it's also truly, truly disturbing to think about what's happening in other parts of the world. And we're all, of course, in this together. It would be wonderful to be able to travel to India. And right now I am very fearful for people being able to make that kind of a trip. So I simply wanted to say, please keep that in your mind. That is not an upbeat and happy way to start the talk this afternoon, but I wanted to say something because I think it's very important. Today we're going to be looking at some really wonderful little objects in the collection. When I was first approached to do this today, I thought, hey, let's look at all the small little tiny things that we have throughout the museum's collections. And to be really honest, once we started filming in the galleries a few weeks ago, I wound up talking about netsuke until all the time ran out. We didn't even go and see, other small things like the tsuba that are just across in the gallery, right next door, or the snuff bottles, wonderful little Chinese objects, or some of the other objects in our Himalayan collection, or in collections of art from around the world, collections from Korea, collections from South Asia. They're wonderful little things hiding in almost every one of our galleries. And I want to encourage you, when you come to the museum, spend a little time looking at those small things. I mean, the big objects, they always attract your attention, but some of the small things have some of the most fascinating little stories to tell, and they can really capture your imagination. So with that said, today we're going to have a little tour of the netsuke collection, and I think Nicole is going to, or perhaps Michael is going to launch us in to the video right now. I'm sure it's going to launch soon. I just can't. Oh,
Hi, I'm Robert Mintz, Deputy Director here at the Asian Art Museum. I'm really glad you can join me today. We're going to take a small tour of some of the smallest things in the museum collection. They are some of my favorites, and I want to show you why they spark my imagination. Today, we're going to be walking around in the Aina and Atsuhiko Tateuchi Japan galleries, and I'm going to show you works from the 18th and the 19th centuries. The objects I'm going to show you today are some of the smallest in the museum's collection. These objects are called netsuke. They're Japanese carved toggles, the ends of little pouches that would have been hung from a man's belt. So during the 18th and 19th century, these little toggles that sort of button up at the top, the netsuke, were used by men to hold this pouch in place. So when they went out of their home, they wanted to carry small items with them. They would take one of these small pouches, fill it with the items, and then tuck that toggle up underneath their sash, their obi, around their traditional costume. Just having an item like that to decorate your attire is something that's not unique to Japan. Of course, we see this around the world. I myself am wearing cufflinks. This one happens to be the little logo of our museum. We do this, and in Japan they did this, and they took it to a kind of adventurous new level. They hired carvers to carve ivory and wood, shell, bone, and exotic materials into fantastic little sculptures. So if you look very closely over here, you'll see an inro with an image of an ox on its surface, and up at the top, a netsuke, also with an ox. And you might think to yourself, well, was this person maybe a farmer? Probably not. It was probably a merchant in the city who was aware that during this particular year, the ox was that Chinese symbol of the zodiac year of the ox. This might be an object that someone would carry just for that year, or perhaps they were born in the year of the ox, and so would remind people of their identity, their persona. In the same way, my cufflinks show you that I work at this museum. I'm going to show you a variety of different netsuke, each one of them telling a different kind of story. And I think the thing to think about as you're looking at netsuke is to think, who would have worn this? Why would they have worn it? And what would the people around them have thought as they saw these tiny little sculptures hanging from the front of each man's belt? Come with me over here. So these are some of the best netsuke in our collection. You can see them arranged here on a variety of little plastic shelves, and you can very quickly understand that these little sculptural pieces tell stories. They show us figures from history, they show us figures from myth, they show us all kinds of interesting subjects. And I want to draw your attention to two netsuke that are down here right beside me. One of them has a man on a horse with an attendant. That's Ariwara no Narihira. Ariwara no Narihira is one of the 6 immortal poets of classical Japan. He lived a long time ago, back in the 9th century. He was a writer of heroic poetry, and he was famous for being, let's say, the most handsome devil around. He was a knockout. And right next to him is another of the 6 immortal poets inscribed on a netsuke, an image of a woman sitting on a tatami, sort of raised mat. Her name was Onono Komachi, and in this case, she is the ravishing beauty of her era. She wrote beautiful love poetry. The amazing thing about the round netsuke with Onono Komachi, it has an inscription written in the tiniest little characters. First, it describes who she was. It gives her name, and it explains that she was one of the 6 immortal poets and explains some of the works that she created. If you turn the netsuke over, then you find her poetry. And you can read the poetry of Onono Komachi if you have a magnifying glass. It's extremely small. But you can imagine this being worn on a man's belt, a man who is clearly cultured, clearly well-read, and who knows the classics. Onono Komachi and Ariwara no Narihira are here presented together because they both are part of this sort of literary constellation of important figures. They were the poetry that every learned and, let's say, high-class Japanese merchant, Japanese member of society, urban dweller, would want to have proudly displayed on their belt. There's a wonderful little netsuke here. If you look very closely, you'll see there's a child leaning, he's sort of on his hands and knees, with one elbow down and a writing brush, a calligraphy brush in his hand. And he appears to be writing on a leaf. There's a leaf that's right underneath him. And then in his other hand, you can see there's a chrysanthemum blossom. Now, seeing those 3 things, a chrysanthemum blossom, a big leaf, and a tiny child with a calligraphy brush, all of the people in, let's say, Kyoto in 1800 would have said, I know who that is. That's Kiku Jido. Kiku means chrysanthemum, and Jido is sort of the immortal chrysanthemum boy. There's a story that a long time ago in China, an emperor gave to Kiku Jido a calligraphy brush and told him to go out and write the Lotus Sutra. The Lotus Sutra is, of course, a Buddhist text. It talks about the important tenets of Buddhism. And Kiku Jido very dutifully copied the Lotus Sutra onto a chrysanthemum leaf. And all of you who have chrysanthemums at home, you know how small chrysanthemum leaves are. So Kiku Jido is very small. But he transcribed this sacred text onto the leaf. And then when the dew fell on the leaf in the morning, he drank a little bit of that dew. And it allowed him to live for 700 years. So he became an immortal. He became a kind of hero of longevity. One of the things that netsuke often do is they convey this idea of a wish, a hope. So as you're getting older, I'm now in my mid-50s, I'm starting to think about wanting to have more time, as opposed to thinking about how much time has gone by. And so having something that really signifies or symbolizes longevity would be very desirable for somebody like me. Of course, I might also give it to my mother. I might give it to my father. I might give it to somebody who's older than me in hopes that they would live a very long life as well. Another favorite of mine, you see this little figure sitting on the shelf up here. This little figure is kind of a good luck figure. On his sleeve, you can see the character for good fortune, in this case, fuku, written right about where his elbow would be. He's the kind of sculpture that one would see typically in a restaurant in Japan, in a tea house. Many people saw him in brothels. He would sit there on the shelf, and he was a figure that was meant to just sort of greet you and to convey the idea of good luck. Good luck for the merchant, good luck for the patron who's coming into the store. What makes this one special is he's actually a very early form of a bobblehead. You know bobblehead dolls. You go to the baseball park and you get your bobblehead Derek Jeter kind of bobbling along. The same thing happens with this figure. He's an example of a kind of what we call trick netsuke. A netsuke that has a kind of playful, funny, animated component. His head is actually suspended. It's on a separate little piece. and it has a tiny string that ties it in place. And if you shake the doll, his head nods back and forth. You can see that his head is really quite white. It's been rubbed many times by the person who wore this netsuke. Seeing that kind of wear is something that becomes very popular amongst people who collect these. You know, netsuke, they were a part of attire, just like cufflinks are part of attire, but over time, as Japanese people during the 19th century began to wear Western-style dress, netsuke became less necessary. But an audience for netsuke grew outside Japan. People began to collect them here in the United States. They also collected them in Europe, and Japanese people collected them as sort of historic objects, things that would remind them of the past. This one would have been very popular because it's very clearly been used. It really played a role. Other netsuke in this case may have been made simply for that collecting trade. Let's move a little further along in the case here because I have some other images to show you. So if you look right in the middle here, you'll see there's a netsuke of a tiny puppy. You might ask yourself, like I said a few minutes ago, what would people have wanted a netsuke like this for? If it's, of course, those literary figures, poets, we know what they were for. If it's a figure that's wishing longevity, we can understand what that's for. Even the bobblehead that wishes you good luck, we know what that's for. But why would you want, at the end of your little cord that's holding your important objects, or maybe your tobacco pouch, a little tiny puppy? This puppy is a good example of the kind of netsuke that one would keep either because they had a love of puppies, possibly, or perhaps this is the kind of netsuke that was made explicitly for the collecting world. Once people have collected a variety of other animals, flora and fauna, if you look next to the puppy, you'll see there's a snake that's strangling a monkey. If you look below the puppy, you'll see that there's a monkey with, I do believe, a lion dog on its back. And if you look next to the puppy, you'll see there's an octopus climbing out of the top of an octopus trap. Those kinds of objects are sort of a cataloging of the natural world. They become sculptural representations of things that people would know from within society, and they're also playful and fun. They're something that people could collect and enjoy. As I said, collecting in the West became popular, so people, like the people who built this collection, gathered these items together to sort of have a catalog or a kind of range of different subject matters. This puppy in particular, if you get a chance to come to the museum and see him, he's incredibly cute. And cuteness is something that starts to appear in netsuke, particularly in the late 19th century. You start to see many netsuke made with a kind of humor or kind of lightness to their presentation. Oh, they're happy little things. And as happy little things, you can imagine them both being part of somebody's attire or perhaps also being something that people would just cherish and keep. Way up here in the corner, a gourd. Gourds became very popular in Japanese history. We, of course, know there are many paintings of gourds, and we have gourds that are used symbolically. It turns out that the name for gourd is homophonous. You know, it sounds the same as some words that are used for good health and for, again, longevity. So gourds become symbolic both because of their long history, but they also become symbolic because they have this sound-like association. Also, gourds, they grow along a vine, and so sometimes in netsuke and sometimes in other small works of Japanese art, you'll see a bunch of gourds together, and that's a kind of subtle reference to having lots of children. The idea that you would be very fertile, you would have lots of gourds. You might look up here on this top shelf. You'll see a pomegranate, gourds and pomegranates, and if you look further down, there's a chestnut, and there's some lotus root, and there's a pear that's being eaten by a worm. All of these are just kind of everyday greengrocer vegetables and fruits, things that you would find in your community. But here, the netsuke carver has taken the advantage of the rare materials that they're using and carved very careful, very precise representations of these various familiar fruits. And of course, each one of them is perfectly ripe. or perhaps even a little bit overripe, so that it would remind people of that sort of richness and abundance that they want to see around them. Down here at the bottom, there's a very strange looking, very fat bird. This is a bird that represents something called the throat-cut sparrow. The story goes something like this. There was this old man. He had a pet. He had a pet sparrow. And he had a very, let's say, stern and bitter spouse. Well, one day, he was off working in the farm. So the sparrow was singing to the old man's spouse. And she was so frustrated and so bitter and so stern, she took her knife and she cut the sparrow's tongue out of its mouth. And the sparrow flew out the window, never to be seen again. Well, the old man comes back to his home and he asks, "Where's my sparrow?" And he can see the blood around the house. And he's very sad because he's lost his pet. Months later, he's up on the mountain gathering firewood, and he comes across a sparrow. This is his sparrow. The sparrow had survived and was living on the mountain. So the old man goes with the sparrow to the sparrow's home. And there at the sparrow's home, he meets the sparrow's spouse and the sparrow's children. And the sparrows give him tea, and the sparrows give him cakes, and the sparrows treat him wonderfully. And the sparrows say, oh, before you go, please, we have a gift to give you. The sparrows bring out 2 big baskets. They fill the baskets with gems and with gold and with silver and with wonderful treasures. The man carries the baskets down the hill, and of course his spouse sees this and she says, "Wow, where were you? Why didn't you come home? And who cares? Look at what you've brought." The next day, his spouse decides she's going to go climb up the mountain and go talk to the sparrows. So she goes up the mountain. The sparrows welcome her in, and they give her tea and they give her cakes. She's ready to leave, and the sparrows say, "Thank you, have a nice day." And she says, "Oh, but wait. You owe me a gift." And the sparrows think for a minute. We owe you a gift. So the sparrows bring a basket, and they present a basket to the woman. They fill her basket with rocks and send her back down the mountain. Her husband, of course, now is fabulously wealthy and living a wonderful life, and she has nothing to show for her trip to the mountain. And this comes together as a kind of lesson, making sure that you care for the least among your community and realize that the benefits of caring for the least among your community is a benefit that will pay itself back to you over and over again. And yet, if you demand from the least of your community, you get nothing in return. It's one of those kind of Japanese folktale myths that I think everybody would have known in one form or another. Everybody might tell the story a little bit different. But when you see this big fat sparrow hanging from somebody's belt, you know that that's somebody who has that kind of emotional connection to the world in which they help the poor and they benefit through that process of caring for the least around them. Netsuke are the kind of thing that together tell a variety of different and distinct stories. They're ways of communicating symbolically and communicating quickly through images, through legends, through inscriptions, actual words written on their surfaces. In a way, they tell the person who meets you on the street who they've met. They tell you about the personality of the person who's wearing them, and they tell you something about the community within which each of these people lived. When you come to the museum, please join me and take a look at the hundreds of netsuke that are arrayed here. And also look around for things that might remind you of netsuke in your own community. If you think about it, you accessorize your outfits, you dress yourself in ways that communicate to the outside, just as the Japanese people of the 18th and 19th century did. It's a subtle kind of game. It's a game of communicating through symbols and through shapes and through stories that I think you'll find very fulfilling.
All right. And before we kick off the Q&A, I actually have a question for all of you. So let's say that you were looking to spice up your accessories, add a little bit of flair to it. So you wander on down to the netsuke store. And I'm going to launch a poll right now. If you go to the netsuke store, which one of those categories would you choose as your accessory? Would you choose something like a literary figure, the Six Immortal Poets, something that represents longevity and health, or maybe the Good Luck bobblehead? Do you want something that's just decorative and fun, like the puppy or the octopus, or something that's related to a myth, like the throat-cut sparrow, that also can show your values and your morals? So please drop your thoughts into the poll, and then I will let everybody know what the results are very soon. I'm just going to give us a couple more seconds. And Dr. Mintz, could you please turn on your camera and we will get the Q&A started. Feel free to start putting your questions into the Q&A and we will get those started momentarily.
Hi, Nicole. You know, actually, I think you need to re-enable my camera because it says unable to start video. I don't know why, but nonetheless, I'm sure it'll start soon. And I realized,
Does that work out?
well, there we go. Start my video. Look, now you can see me. I'm not just disembodied voice. I was thinking, oh, I want to vote for one of those things, and then I realized at the bottom of the poll it says panelists can't vote.
What would be yours?
And I thought, oh, I want to vote. Well, I was going to vote for two, but I think I'd wear the myth, you know, something like the tongue-cut sparrow. I love that little sparrow. But I think that's sort of me.
I would choose the octopus, one of the decorative ones. I really like that octopus. So I'm just going to share the results right now.
All right, great.
So everybody can see, and it looks like the myth one.
Oh, you know, we all like myths. I mean, presumably we would have American culture myths that we would wear, and that would be fascinating. I don't know what I would pick from my culture, but anyway, I like the fat sparrow. But if I find any octopus netsuke floating around anywhere, I'll keep you in mind.
Thank you. I'd be happy to go check that out.
Okay, certainly.
Okay, so the first couple of questions are starting to pile in. So Dr. Mintz, can you explain how the netsuke toggle is worn on a man's belt?
Oh yeah, you know, I kind of whisked past that in the tour video there. So what you want to imagine is, you know, the netsuke itself is about what, 1.5 inches. Let's say if one of them is round, it would be like a ball, 1.5 inches in diameter. Yeah, every netsuke has 2 little holes in it through which you would pass a silk cord. So you would take your little cord, you'd tie it through the netsuke. Then that cord passes through a bead called an ojime, and then it's attached, the cord is attached to whatever's going to hang from your belt. So there are things called sagemono, the things that hang. And they could be inro, these little boxes. It could be tobacco pouches, I mentioned. It could be a writing set, you know, a brush and ink could be hanging from one of these. But what happens is you take the netsuke with the 2 cords coming out of it, and you push it under your belt and then pop it out the top. So the netsuke sits outside your belt, you know, on right above the belt. The 2 cords go behind your belt, behind your obi, and then the hanging object is hanging below the obi. So it's like you've kind of treated the space between your belly and your obi as a buttonhole, and you've pushed this netsuke button up through that hole, and it hangs on the outside. I think does that make sense? Can you picture that in your mind?
A little bit, kind of like woven together.
Maybe almost. It's a little, you know, if anybody is familiar with pocket watches in the West, in our culture, I mean, we don't wear pocket watches anymore, but pocket watches would often be held on a chain. And at the opposite end of the chain, there was what's called a fob, which is essentially a netsuke. I mean, it's a heavy object at the other end of a watch chain that would be tucked into your vest pocket. So you'd tuck your watch into one pocket and the fob into the pocket on the opposite side, and it would serve the same purpose. So it's a way to keep it from falling on the ground. So that's about all.
And then you talked a little bit about the materials that were used to make netsuke. Some were made of ivory, some were made of wood. And so can you talk a little bit more about the various materials that were used? And also, what is the most unusual material that you've seen?
Okay, no, go to the most unusual at the end. First, I'll say they used a variety of, you know, of available materials. Ivory was very popular because it is comparatively easy to carve. It holds its shape very well and can be very ornately carved. So ivory appealed to people. It's also, it's a sort of, it's a challenged material in the present day. We all are sad about the demise of elephant populations around the world from overuse of ivory and harvesting of ivory. So please don't buy things made of ivory, public. That would be a terrible idea. We should really oppose the trade in ivory to the extent that we can. But historically, ivory was used partly because it is a material that has a very nice feel in the hand. When you hold onto a piece of ivory, it's sort of warm, and it also holds its shape very effectively. So ivory was popular. Antler and horn were both popular. So if you think of animals with antlers, stag antler, you also walrus teeth. Walrus teeth make very interesting netsuke. Narwhal horn. So, a narwhal is that whale that has a single tusk coming out of its forehead or out of its head. That is a very interesting kind of, it's a little like ivory, but it has it grows in a spiral. And so the netsuke made of it, you can see the actual spiral in the netsuke, which is fascinating. Rhinoceros horn is used. Hornbill beak, I think, is probably the most unusual material that I've seen. Hornbills, are a tropical bird, again, sadly endangered now and over-harvested at a certain time. But netsuke carvers would get a hold of a little bit of hornbill horn and carve that into just fascinating objects that have this rich orangish color. Hornbills have a very colorful beak, kind of like a toucan. But then, of course, rare woods, ebony, rosewood, Chinese woods like huanghuali, those kinds of exotic hardwoods were very popular for netsuke, as were, some stones. Stones are rather challenging, but some softer stones were carved into netsuke. And then, of course, metals, cast metals used, cast and chased metals like gold, silver, and bronze were used for netsuke. So you can make a netsuke out of almost anything. Today, you use plastic. You can get fabulous plastic netsuke made from industrial plastics. So that's a nice, other than the terrible environmental results of making plastic, it's perhaps better for the animals in the environment to use that material.
Have you ever seen netsuke made out of clay, brass, or jade?
Yeah, not so many jades. Jades, of course, are used for many Chinese works of art. In Japan, there is a use of jade, but not as much. Brass netsuke and what were the other materials you just mentioned? Bronze, yes, definitely.
Bronze and clay.
Oh, clay, yes, yes. So there are fired both porcelain and stoneware netsuke. And they can be really quite wonderful because, of course, glazing them, you can get all kinds of rich color, and they're beautiful things. So.
Great. And then you mentioned that most of the netsuke, it sounds like, were worn by men, but did women not wear netsuke, or did they use it kind of as like maybe a different type of ornament, like a necklace or anything like that?
I would never, no, I don't think they wore them as necklaces. I shouldn't say that they were exclusively worn by men because they were not exclusively worn by men, but men's kimono and men's obi, men would often wear a netsuke to hold these, objects around their belt. Women, in many cases, because women wore kimono with long sleeves, there was actually a space in the sleeve to hold some of their items, almost like a pocket, a sleeve pocket. Men didn't have that same sleeve pocket for holding things, so used their obi instead to hold objects. So more netsuke were made for men's attire, but that's not to say they were exclusively worn by men. Women would use small netsuke also. And there are also very small inro, those little boxes that are used for holding precious objects and things that you want to carry with you. There are small inro that were specifically designed for women. So again, smaller, which is kind of interesting, but also with a longer cord, because frequently women wore an obi that was wider. And so the cord would have to pass all the way around that wider obi than, of course, a man's sash.
Gotcha. Okay. And then would netsuke be given as gifts? Were they a popular gift item, or was it more of like a personal thing that somebody would buy for themselves just out of personal interests and things like that?
That's a really good question. And I'll start with, I'm not sure. I suspect in the earlier time, so what is the earlier time? The 18th and 19th centuries, the early part of the 19th century, I suspect netsuke were frequently handed down in a family or acquired by a family and sort of doled out to people within the family. So you could consider that a kind of gift, or you'd go and have a specific netsuke carved for you. When you get to the later part of the 19th century, after the Meiji Restoration, so that sort of 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, because Japanese costume is falling out of favor and is being replaced in many people's wardrobes by Western costume, Western dress, netsuke, I think, sort of change rather dramatically, not only because they start to get sold into collectors, collections of netsuke. So there are people making them for the West and making them for Japanese collectors of netsuke. But there's also, I think, more of a kind of giving netsuke to people, not necessarily to be worn. So I think the idea of a gift or a presentation netsuke becomes probably more common in the late 19th century. So maybe you go to a state dinner and one of the things you receive is a commemorative netsuke of that event. So is that something you would ever wear? No, I don't think you ever would. But it's the kind, that's where it becomes a kind of formal gift. But I suspect there was always a little bit of the exchange of netsuke as a way of kind of conveying a good wish for someone you want to impress or someone you care about.
And were netsuke ever gifted to children? Was it common for children to have them, or was it mostly for adults who had money and important things to carry around?
I think they're for adults. I don't think netsuke. Somebody out there in the broader world can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think netsuke were made for children. It's tempting to think that something like the little puppy might be a child's netsuke, or a dopey looking frog or an interesting looking chicken, but I don't think they were for children. I mean, they're playful. There's no question about it. But I think they are, they really are a little bit of attire. They're a little bit of your dress. And so, what could we compare it to? We give everything to children now, so I have no idea what we would compare it to in our society. But I think of them, they're more like cufflinks or buttons than they are like toys. So.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned in the presentation that, we had the decorative netsuke with the puppy and the octopus, and generally people would have other netsuke before and they would add those to complement it. So was it common for people to have a variety of netsuke, or was it like they would just buy one and have it for long periods of time and then replace it when the rest wore out? And also, is that related to social class?
Interesting. I can see you really like the octopus netsuke, and I think we should have a conversation about the octopus. What is it about octopuses, Nicole? Is this something? But no, to get to your question though, I think my guess, and here, I've got to do a little guessing because honestly, I don't know. But my guess would be people owned many, in most cases. I mean, certainly there may have been people who only had one netsuke and they wore it all the time, if they wore it, it was but I think most people would wind up with several. and some people probably with many. In the same way that, do you have just one pair of shoes? I don't have just one pair of shoes. I have lots of shoes. And I kind of really like getting more shoes. And some of them I almost never wear, but boy, I see them and I think, ooh, I've got to have those shoes. And there's one time when I want to wear them. And I suspect netsuke were a little bit like that some people probably accumulated huge numbers of them. And we see, once netsuke become a collectible item, we see them in vast numbers. But I suspect people would have quite a few around. And then choose one depending on, their particular outfit. What do you want to look like today? I think today's Octopus Day. Oh yeah, I'm gonna wear that octopus.
And then are there any known artists that specialized in netsuke? Are there artists that were like signature or the collectors, or was it just independent merchants or artists that created them?
No, so there are many very well-known netsuke carvers, and there are, so if you turn a netsuke upside down, many of them are signed by the maker. So you see the name of the master carver who carved it, almost always men, so I guess they get to be called master carvers. But they were, effectively, I think, trading on their fame, trading on their name. So families of netsuke carvers develop where we see the same name sort of passed along generation to generation. Of ivory carvers, for example, or of wood carvers. And they develop a sort of signature style. So, I think there's evidence for they're developing a kind of, really a market for particular netsuke carvers netsuke. And, if you live in a particular region, you probably know the most famous netsuke carver of your region or the family of carvers in your region, and would presumably get a netsuke carved by that master carver lineage to wear. And of course, many of the netsuke that were produced in the 18th century would have been produced in the various provinces of Japan, so the prefectures. Before there were prefectures, there were feudal domains. And from the feudal domains, the samurai of that feudal domain, the lead member of that group, the daimyo, was required to spend alternate years in Edo, in what the city that would become Tokyo. And you would, of course, want to be wearing a netsuke by the master carver or the carver lineage of your domain when you're in the capital, because people would see it and they would know, oh, you're from, one location or another that's famous for its ivory netsuke, or famous for its ivory carvers in general. And this would be a way to kind of show off your locale on your dress. So, that was a large number of people who were serving in that kind of feudal system that required them to be in the capital. And of course, they would be required also to dress appropriately and elaborately. So netsuke played into that world.
And speaking of carving, we're getting a lot of questions into the chat about carving itself. So I can imagine some materials like wood were so much easier to carve than others, like ivory or a narwhal horn. And so what kind of tools would they use to carve netsuke? And also, how long would it take to create one? Of course, depending on the material.
Depends on how well carved it is. I suppose you can carve it very fast if you don't want to do a good job. Ivory is remarkably, okay, I'm going to say it's easy to carve, and you don't want to see me try to carve it, but it is a relatively soft and forgiving material to carve. So unlike many people may have heard of the ways in which jade is carved, jade is very hard to shape and is typically abraded. So it's not cut or struck because it's a very hard and brittle stone. Ivory is literally cut. So a sharp metal tool is used to carve ivory. The same kinds of tools that are used to carve wood. And many netsuke, because if they're worn, they're going to be rubbed by your clothing, by your hands, by your, whatever you're carrying. So, netsuke tend to be made of materials that are somewhat softer, so that they are forgiving of that kind of, rubbing back and forth across your, clothing. That means they develop a patina, a kind of shine, or a kind of smooth, softened surface, which is a lovely characteristic. But there are some netsuke that are made of very hard materials that are, carved with steel chisels and are worked in other ways. But typically, I think the vast majority of netsuke are made of either carved wood or carved ivory or horn. And ivory and horn, antler, those kinds of materials are all sort of similar in terms of how they would be addressed. They're not too hard to carve if you know how to be a carver. If you're like me, they're very, very hard to carve. So.
And then, so when, for example, at the beginning, when you spoke about the 6 immortal poets and the netsuke that were focused around them, they had the poetry carved into the netsuke itself. And so how did the artist place the tiny inscriptions on them so that they're permanent on the material and they're readable after so many years?
Yeah, so that image of Ono no Komachi, the woman sitting on the tatami, that's a piece of ivory. It's a disc cut sort of horizontally from an elephant tusk. And you can, if you look closely at it, you can see the grain of the ivory and the kind of the sort of intersecting lines that are characteristic of ivory. So it's very clear what the material is, and it is just one color. Ivory is that sort of slightly off-white, I guess we call it ivory colored, right? It's almost white. In order for that sort of black text to show up, or the image of Ono no Komachi to show up, first it's carved into the surface of the ivory, and then ink is applied to that surface. So black, writing ink, calligraphy ink, is rubbed onto the surface and then rubbed off. And it's only where the little scratching into the surface is that the ink stays, and the polished surface, the ink is wiped away. So what you see is sort of the residual ink in the carved spaces. And that contrast of black ink and white ivory it makes it very easy to see, very difficult to read because it's so small. And so the carver, I'm sure, used a very tiny, very sharp steel tool to simply scratch that text onto the surface, which I can't imagine. It must have been incredibly hard to do, but it's the kind of skill that you develop over a lifetime of practice, and then you're a master of your trade. So
Practice makes perfect.
that's right. And this was people's livelihood. It's their job, and if it's your job, you work hard at it until you can create something that's really quite marvelous.
And I believe in the video you stated most of the netsuke in our collection are from the 19th and 18th century. And so were netsuke made before that? And if so, what are the earliest known netsuke?
So, that's a question that I was thinking, oh, I know this. I would say, the earliest netsuke appear late in the 16th century, and then during the 17th century, they become more and more common. During the 18th and 19th centuries, early part of the 19th century, there are many of them made, and they become very common. And then it tapers off at the end of the 19th century. And then I began to read around this way and read around that way, and I'm not sure when the first netsuke appeared, but many people seem to assert that some of the first netsuke were long. They were, like the length of this pen in my hand, 6-7 inches long, and were used to carry, sort of other items hung from the belt, heavier items. So they were larger. We have a few long netsuke, maybe 5-inch long netsuke in our case that are figural. They're standing, sort of long-legged figures standing on the shelves there. And those were made pretty early, so in the early 17th century. But When were the first netsuke made? I'm not sure. Probably in the 16th century. But they become works of art only, I think, in the later 17th, the 18th and 19th centuries. They really become what we think of as netsuke today.
And are netsuke still being produced just for mass consumption? Do people still use them today?
Well, and they're being produced. So yes, the answer is yes, they are still being produced. They're being produced by some carvers as sculptural works of art to show off their skills and to create expressive forms. They are very infrequently worn at this point in time. People just don't wear netsuke very often, but they are produced for collectors and produced using exotic materials and using just incredible techniques to produce these beautiful little objects. They're not, I mean, they are also mass produced for sort of the tourist trade and for the, like I said, plastic. You can make them out of plastic and you can find them for sale in many, many places. You can also find just sort of, let's say less elaborately carved netsuke for sale to collectors made, in the last 10 years. So they are out there. Serious collectors of contemporary netsuke are effectively following the careers of a very small group of artisans, who work in the medium of carved today, mostly carved antler and bone. And they're really interesting. There are a couple of American collectors. There's a famous, in fact, a member of the Japanese royal family who has a very large collection of contemporary netsuke that's been exhibited here in the U.S. And it's interesting to follow. It's an art form that I think, once it was what you had to wear, and now it's an art form that kind of is a little bit. It's a very conservative art form. Let's put it that way. It looks back in time.
Okay, and it looks like we have time for one more question. And so, are all of the netsuke in the museum's collection currently on view? In the past Artscapes, we've talked to a variety of curators that have to rotate through their collections because textiles, for example, can only be on view for a certain amount of time. So how often do we rotate our netsuke collection? Is it all on view all the time?
It's not all on view all the time. How long have I worked at the museum? I've worked here 5 years, and I don't think I've seen any of the netsuke rotate. They're not, for the most part, the ones we have out on view are quite stable in the light and are not degrading. We do have more. I will say the most interesting, the most finely carved, the most sort of narratively rich, the ones that tell great stories, they're on view in the gallery. There are more, I think we have more oxes. We probably have more of virtually every animal of the zodiac. That's a very popular, the Chinese zodiac animals, the 12 animal cycle, that's a very popular theme. And so there are many of those still in storage. I think one of the reasons netsuke might come out to be put on view would be in the context of a special exhibition, maybe looking at a particular theme. I mean, perhaps a theme of the Chinese animals of the Chinese zodiac. And so suddenly we would use those netsuke that are in our stored collection to help tell that broader story while maintaining the ones that are in the gallery space. But we don't typically rotate them simply because they don't really need to be rotated. And we want to make sure that we use our resources wisely and rotate the paintings and the textiles. Those are things that really do need to be kept out of the light as much as possible so that they survive forever. That's always the goal. But netsuke are durable if as objects of attire. People wore them. And since people wore them, they are designed in most cases to take some abuse. So they're not nearly as fragile as some of the other works in the collection.
All right. Well, thank you, Rob, for being a guest on today's program. This has been so fascinating, and I just can't wait to go up into the galleries and analyze all of the netsuke. I feel like they're kind of easy to miss, but because they're so tiny.
You'll never miss them again. No, well, and you saw the one octopus netsuke, because I know octopuses are, of course, your spirit animal. That's the only explanation, is your spirit animal is an octopus. I think there are at least 4 more octopuses in that case. So go to the netsuke case, go look for the octopuses. They were a very popular subject because they're kind of, they're lighthearted, they're cute, they're interesting. And of course, Japan is, surrounded by the ocean. So there's octopuses kind of everywhere. They're also delicious. So I do believe there's at least one netsuke where the octopus is dinner. So always remember, you can eat them too. But thanks, Nicole. This was fun. And we'll have to do it again. Next time, the other tiny things would be sword fittings and snuff bottles. Don't you think we should go talk about those?
Yes, part 2 of tiny things.
There we go. More tiny things, yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for viewing our program today. Thank you to all our viewers. Thank you to all of our members. I see so many familiar names in the chat and in our participant box. So thank you everybody for logging on today. Huge thank you to Sarah and Michael, who are helping oversee everything on the back end. Big thanks to Zach and Mira for all of your hard work and all of your talents in pulling this entire program together. We will have another Artiscape in 2 weeks from today, where we will be learning about bamboo baskets from Japan. So if you haven't already signed up for the next Artiscape, be sure to sign up before the next one. You have 2 weeks to go, so you have a little bit of time. And besides that, we have lots of virtual programs that happen throughout the week. We have docent talks, our Takeout Tuesdays, lunchtimes conversations about art. We have meditation sessions. We have so much going on. Even though we can't have on-site events yet at the Asian Art Museum, we do hope to launch those later in this year. So stay tuned. Join our e-news and you'll be the first to know about all the exciting things that are happening. So thank you, everybody, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.